Finally, he managed to pass all the levels of this incredibly difficult game. He felt relief. For 10 years, no one could pass even half the levels in this game, and he passed all of them. Now he sat and remembered the game characters he had become accustomed to during this time. Most of all, he was upset by the departure of the Saint, a high-ranked character. Lucas, the main character of the game, survived, and this became the main achievement. The most difficult level was completed by an ordinary person. His gaming nickname, Typical Nerd, now occupied the first line in the rating. Standing among the corpses, the character Lucas showed no emotions, even after defeating the boss. This hero remained a mystery. Now the gamer analyzed the path he had taken. He tried to understand Lucas's behavior, but the character seemed to have its own will. The game developer should have rewarded the one who passed all the levels, so thought the young Victor and his friends. Unexpectedly, he heard a notification. It was a message from the director of Empire Defense himself. He expressed gratitude for the interest shown in the game and for the victory achieved. The director admitted that he had long despaired of seeing the finale. Tien experienced mixed feelings from such attention. It seemed to him that the reward no longer brought its former joy. Further, Typical Nerd learned about the upcoming second stage of the game, and the developer offered testing to him specifically, admiring his abilities. He couldn't believe that the author of the masterpiece himself would stoop to correspondence with a player, and at first took the creator for a fraudster. Suddenly, the monitor screen began to display blurry images and strange signs, as if the technology itself began to transmit mysterious messages without explaining the reasons. Out of nowhere, a powerful explosion thundered with a bright flash that blinded the eyes, and the world momentarily lost its familiar outlines, leaving a feeling of chaos and danger. The blast wave forcefully knocked down a young soldier in dress uniform, throwing him aside. The ground trembled, and the air filled with dust and burning coals. Stones, debris from walls, and burning pieces rained down, and the soldier, trying to protect himself, fell to the ground, covering his head with his hands, feeling the relentless danger around him. Several subsequent explosions filled the air with the sharp smell of gunpowder. In the distance, people in uniforms and armor were approaching, creating a sense of impending threat. The young soldier found himself in the epicenter of events, lost his temper from not understanding what was happening, and, without distinguishing addressees, shouted a series of curses, trying to express his rage and fear. A little later, before his eyes appeared a whole regiment of soldiers with spears and red banners boldly developing in the smokescreen. The atmosphere was tense, and every step could cost lives. Loyal warriors rushed to prevent enemies from penetrating the fortress walls, to block the way and stop the enemy's advance by any means. The young fighter watched, not understanding what was happening. He sat among the rubble and fragments, as if in a movie, feeling the war with every fiber of his body. Each movement of the enemy seemed to him simultaneously distant and frighteningly real. Suddenly, a stocky soldier in armor approached him, causing internal tension. The young warrior didn't understand who was before him and what to expect from this person, but readiness to defend intensified. Their swords clashed with a deafening clang, heralding a merciless battle. The opponent's strength was palpable, but the young man tensed, trying to anticipate each move and not allow defeat. Before they could exchange blows, the warrior in armor suddenly fell face down before the young fighter, falling apart in apologies and pleas for mercy, causing confusion and doubt in the young man. At this moment, the young man realized that the Imperial Highness was himself. The awareness of his own role covered him with both pride and fear of what was happening. The attempt to calm the servant was interrupted by another explosion. The wave from it threw the young man aside, forcing him to focus on the battle again and make quick decisions to survive. Coming to his senses, he realized that it was a bomb, and the enemy's attacks were intensifying. Every moment required lightning-fast reaction and awareness that the defense of the fortress depended on him personally. Among the crowd of subjects, the same phrase was repeated, like an echo, not to let the enemies climb the fortress walls. The young warrior understood that now the responsibility lay entirely on his shoulders. Everything was mixed: people, voices, stones, gunpowder, and fire. The battle raged, sparing no one. Blood flowed to the young warrior's feet. Bodies fell. It was a terrifying spectacle of war. From behind the high wall came strange sounds: growling, blows, the crack of metal. The howl of warriors and the steps of heavy equipment merged into one loud chaos, capturing all the senses of the fighters. Unexpectedly, something terrible appeared before the young warrior. A giant spider the size of a human appeared on the battlefield, its skin shimmering with magical crystals, sparkling in the fire of battle. The warriors of the Imperial Highness, knowing no fear, rushed at the many-legged enemy. They fought like shadows among flame and smoke, throwing themselves into mortal combat without hesitation. By command to immobilize the insect, a fierce battle ensued. The soldiers attacked with all their might, their blades flashing, blood and sparks from clashes flying in all directions, creating chaos and horror. The young lord entered the battle. His body trembled with fear, his heart pounded wildly. He saw the spider, gigantic and deadly dangerous, and realized the fragility of his own life on the field. Looking point blank at the opponent, he couldn't determine where was dream and where was reality. All sounds, fire and smoke merged into one terrible stream, from which it was impossible to look away. Understanding the inequality of forces, the young man tried to command the monster, but the spider, as if knowing no fear, ignored the commands. A feeling of helplessness squeezed his chest, giving birth to despair and rage simultaneously. He had a premonition of a lethal outcome and couldn't accept such a death. Cold horror froze in his eyes. His body seemed to turn to stone, but his consciousness tried to find at least the slightest possibility to survive. Suddenly, from the thick smoke screen came footsteps, a glow appeared, and a fair-haired young man stepped onto the battlefield. The young lord didn't understand who came to help and where the unexpected savior appeared from. The next thing heard from the darkness was a sense of an order to deny reality, after which sharp sword strikes rang out, echoing in the empty corridors of the castle. The fair-haired youth without hesitation threw himself directly into the clutches of the huge monster, knowing no fear, and began to cut up the monstrous spider with precise movements tearing through its hard armor. When the insect was completely dismembered, before those present in all its glory appeared a new character, his figure radiating confidence and power, inspiring respect in all witnesses. The fair-haired warrior approached the frightened young man, carefully observing him and trying to understand why the Imperial Highness looked so unusual, almost bewildered. While the new participant in the battle was interested in whether the Emperor was wounded, the Lord himself noted to himself that somehow he felt acquainted with this daredevil, as if he had seen him before. After a few minutes of the young warrior's reflections, he was struck as if by lightning. He realized that before him stood a character from the world's most difficult game, whose name was Lucas, and this discovery shocked him. Lucas turned out to be extremely perceptive, carefully studying the Emperor's face and instantly noticing the surprise in his eyes, understanding that the Lord had again forgotten his name, which caused a quiet smile. However, the Imperial Highness began a stage of denial. He couldn't believe what was happening, resisting reality, as if the very air around was trying to reject the events unfolding here. Two young warriors stood shoulder to shoulder on the battlefield, among the ruins and remains of the recently killed monster, assessing the situation and preparing for new challenges hiding beyond the horizon. The entire area and the surrounding people seemed painfully familiar, and then, typical nerd realized that before him was not the Imperial Highness, but an ordinary gamer who somehow found himself in a new version of Empire Defense. Without restraining his emotions, Tien cursed. It was one thing to sit at home and masterfully participate in this carnage, and quite another to find himself on the other side of the monitor, where only he himself could save himself. Lucas's call seemed to tear Tien out of the horror that gripped him. Now Lucas, for typical nerd, was not a character, but a friend and protector on whom he could rely. The fair-haired warrior explained to his lord the gravity of the situation and the duty to resist the army of black spiders advancing on them, whose steps were felt by every nerve. Lucas asked typical nerd to be vigilant and patient, because in half an hour it would get dark, and the spiders that attack them and the military base lose their activity and attack power at night. The gamer named Tien was haunted by thoughts about why Lucas was protecting him, and why everyone here called him your Imperial Highness, as if he really was an important figure. Twilight came, and the spiders retreated to their positions. Tien began to question the fair-haired young man about the time and location. He answered with polished precision. February 28th. 649 according to the imperial calendar. Looking at the fortress of the military base, Tien caught déjà vu. At some stage of his game, he had already encountered a date that would come tomorrow, March 1st, 649, as if history was repeating itself. This was the date of the beginning of training that everyone went through. Ash von Hyde Evershade suddenly burst from Tien's lips. "This is my virtual name. Call me only that," he shouted to Lucas, demanding recognition. Tien was extremely upset about which character he represented in this game. Here he was not a gamer, but the worst commander, through whose fault most of the warriors and allies died. It was his lot to go through the training in the worst way, because one day this character would leave the castle, which would lead to irreversible consequences for the entire game world and its inhabitants. Regardless of the difficulty of the levels, among which was the hellish one, this mega game about defending the Empire became known because it was completed by a single person in the world. In the training, there was a system window, and Tien would most likely not be able to pass it completely because the conditions were built on the guaranteed defeat of a beginner. The training level initially sentenced the gamer to defeat. At the very beginning of the story, Lucas alone ran from aliens, trying to survive in chaos and continuous danger. The game lasted 3 years, but already at the start there was a difficult task to defeat monsters, hunting for which would become possible only after a year and a half. Ash von Hyde Evershade needed to find a way out at any cost, which in reality didn't exist, and each step only brought him closer to a new trap. There were more than 1,000 levels with black spiders, and the castle walls proved fragile. The only weapon for defense remained the mana cannon, but defeat seemed inevitable. The only winner of the game became its direct participant. He needed to approach each level analytically, building strategy and anticipating consequences. At the Man of Steel level, the player had no opportunity to save or reload the game. Any mistake meant the final end of the attempt and the loss of all efforts. The person who spent 6 months of his life on this game got used to constantly being under tension, in search of instant solutions, which gradually became part of his reality. Tien sincerely believed that his gaming experience would now come in handy like never before. Typical nerd ordered Lucas to gather all subordinates to find a way to save themselves and go from difficulty to difficulty. Gradually, the conference hall began to fill with people who for Tien before were just game characters. Kirem, a miniature red-haired girl with eyes full of determination, attracted attention. Chuck, a tall man with a menacing face that reflected all the horror of many years of war, stood in the corner, assessing the situation. His gaze was stern, but it showed readiness for action. Darkhood, a nerd and geek by appearance, looked insignificant, but behind his calm exterior was hidden the ability to perform tasks when it was necessary for the team. Tien felt joy seeing them alive and healthy, but the professional gamer understood that a sad finale awaited each of them ahead, and this caused internal tension. When all the characters took their places, Tien began to distribute tasks. Everyone had to prepare for the mission the next day, understand their duties, and show maximum skills. Kiram was the first to receive a task. She carefully listened to Tien's instructions and was completely ready for feats, understanding that the safety of the entire group and the success of the operation depended on her actions. Kiram possessed 2 gifts, magical fire attacks and the ability to cast spells on spells. She was tasked with standing as a shield before the spiders, repelling their attacks. Chuck, who specialized in attacks, received the task of penetrating the enemy's rear and disrupting the formation, using his skills for maximum destructive effect. Darkhood, by his nature a healer, under Tien's leadership became a sniper, combining healing of allies with aimed strikes at enemies, providing support from a distance. Lucas also didn't remain without work. He was to hold the front line at the wall, becoming the commander of the rest of the army, directing their actions and maintaining discipline on the battlefield. After the distribution of tasks, an awkward silence hung. Chuck's cry of explosion broke the atmosphere. The experienced soldier considered Tien's plan a failure and disastrous for the entire team, feeling the threat. Tien understood the soldier's indignation, but could only justify himself by the fact that he acted in accordance with the role of the character he turned out to be, embodying Ash von Hyde Evershade. Seeing the dejected faces of his subordinates, Tien reminded them of his status as the Emperor's son, officer, and commander-in-chief of the Corps, emphasizing that disobedience in this game was unacceptable. Chuck considered him insane, giving illogical orders. Tien recognized these qualities, but it was precisely them that he had to apply in practice to realize his prototype. If they wanted victory, Tien couldn't lose initiative. He understood that he had to act in accordance with the character, and therefore drew his sword from its sheath, preparing for action. He declared his commander's right, demanding unquestioning obedience. Mercilessly, with the blade of the sword, he struck Kirem, demonstrating determination and readiness for harsh measures. An ominous smile appeared on Tien's face. He understood that all those present had abilities and tasks, but his role was to be a psychopath leading the team to victory. A whisper of discontent and contempt swept through the hall. Tien approached Kirem, intending to use her skills and capabilities in accordance with the plan he had carefully developed. The commander reminded Kirem of her ability to resist fire, which arose in childhood during a goblin attack on the village, which made her a valuable team member in critical moments. Previously, the game didn't require frequent use of Kirem's character, but now Tien was building new plans and counted on her much more actively, considering the strategic importance of her skills. Having greatly emboldened from his ambitions, typical nerd approached the game creator, warning of his intention to pass all levels and after victory to deal with him personally. Having finished his speech, Tien brought Kirem his apologies for the radical approach to training fighters, understanding that the methods were too harsh and required courage. Turning to Chuck, Tien reminded him of his childhood misdeeds when he was a thief, and the soldier didn't ask the command where such details were known from. Professional pickpockets have the ability to remain calm in the face of danger, and this was exactly what the commander demanded from his subordinates in any situations. You are capable of remaining unnoticed even in a crowded place, Tien mentally noted, waving his sword, controlling the situation and checking Chuck's readiness for orders. The experienced soldier bowed his head and began to pick his words, answering feverishly so as not to anger the commander-in-chief and fulfill the requirements as carefully as possible. After changing anger to mercy, Tien turned to Darkhood, who was huddled in the corner, noting that his vision was excellent despite the glasses, and his eyes had already seen a friend's death. Darkhood felt deep sadness, remembering the loss, asked to return his friend, but dared to ask why the commander gathered them all and what goal he was pursuing in this situation. Kirem, Chuck and Lucas also took part in asking the question, each reacting in their own way to what was happening, assessing the commander's strength and their own capabilities in the face of the task. But Tien addressed Darkut directly, reminding the crying warrior of his strength, ability to defeat the spider army, and the need to show courage before the commander, despite personal feelings. Lucas intervened sharply, and without warning in the conversation, he reminded the commander that with any deviation from the plan, everyone on this territory would be destroyed, without exceptions, and the right to error. Tien continued the discussion with Darkut. He made it clear to the frightened warrior that in case of failure, he would voluntarily give his life into the hands of his subordinates, but while the situation was stable, he demanded complete obedience to orders. He insisted that hatred toward him or toward anyone else should become a source of strength and fury in the upcoming confrontation with the spiders, and not a reason for split and panic. Typical nerd sincerely admitted his own mistakes in command, remaining Ash von Hyde Evershade, but asked his people to believe him right now when their survival depended on trust. The gamer who found himself inside the game honestly realized the absence of ready solutions and admitted that the only way out remained a risky all-in, where the price of delay was higher than any possible mistake. The rumble of drums spread throughout the area, carrying an alarming message about the approaching army of spider monsters, and this rhythm pressed on consciousness stronger than any words, preparing for the inevitable collision. The infantry of the spider army slowly but inexorably approached the walls of the empire, filling the space with black movement, in which was felt cold discipline and alien hive logic. The plan was to buy time, lure out the queen controlling the army of black spiders, and destroy her with the help of a modernized cannon capable of turning the entire campaign around. Tien realized that determining the queen's location without a map and visual landmarks was impossible, which meant the first step to victory should be creating an accurate terrain map. The winning gamer, not losing a minute, recalled his gaming skills and experience working with minimaps that he had seen before and immediately began recreating them. Having found the monster's marks, finding the queen proved difficult because there wasn't a single mark on the map, and Tien's plan B had to compensate for this shortcoming and ensure the success of the operation. Tien collected all the endurance potions, handed them to Chuck, and sent him outside the fortress to distract the enemies, counting on the enemy's attention to focus on his actions. Kiram took part in the operation to eliminate the Spider Queen, using fire magic to block the spiders' access to the fortress and create a temporary advantage for the troops. "Everyone to formation," Lucas commanded, realizing that the longer the battle lasted, the higher the chances of removing the queen from the battlefield, and every moment was worth its weight in gold for the outcome of the battle. Assuming that typical nerd had completed all preparations, Lucas took a deep breath, collecting his thoughts, and prepared to give the decisive command, realizing the responsibility for everyone in the army. But Ash von Hyde Evershade encountered unforeseen difficulties, and canceling the actions of the entire army was already impossible, leaving Tien facing the unpredictability of events and the risk of failure. Lucas immediately gave the fire command, and all the cannons simultaneously fired a volley in the right direction. Explosions deafened the field, but the Spider Queen still remained invulnerable, hiding in the rear. Tien, in the image of Ash von Hyde Evershade, reflected that the queen would most likely appear in the midst of the attack, and while she stayed in the rear, the entire strategy remained incomplete, and time to act was shortening. He called Darka to him and asked if he saw the queen on the field, but the four eyes could only make out a mass of spiders, while Tien was sure that among them was hidden the target that needed to be watched. A horned monster with eyes full of fire, standing opposite Darkut, as if watching him, created tension, and Tien felt that it was precisely his gaze that was searching for the queen, preparing for the next step in the dangerous game. Tien calmed Darkut by saying the monster wasn't as scary as it was painted, especially if going against it with a cannon. A sense of confidence gradually strengthened, tension subsided. Tien informed Darkut that the cannons were turned toward the enemy. He took all responsibility for the plan on himself, allowing the guy to focus on the task without thinking about possible mistakes. Typical nerds spoke convincingly. Darkut became bolder, understanding that soldiers weren't responsible for the outcome of the battle, but only carried out orders, which gave a sense of protection. After Ash added that Darkut's shot would avenge the fallen friend, the guy activated the 1,000-mile eye function, and fear finally disappeared, leaving room for determination. The core flew out of the cannon and flew toward the target. Fractions of seconds dragged slowly. Time seemed to stretch while the projectile flew through the air, leaving behind a light trail of energy. Suddenly, in the distance, an explosion thundered. A pleasant understanding appeared that the enemy target was hit, and tension was replaced by a brief feeling of victory and satisfaction from precise action. Hyde Evershade asked the lookout to report the situation. The answer was brief. The projectile fell right in the epicenter of the gathering of all monsters, which ensured maximum effect from the attack and joy for the team. The accurate hit became the reason for praising Darkut for good vision and excellent sniper skills. His confidence grew, and colleagues noted the accuracy of actions without excessive demonstration. Ash treated Darkut's praises with irony. He understood that in a situation where life and death were at stake, sometimes you forget that you're a four eyes with a geek's appearance, and only the result is more important. Looking into the distance, Tien understood that the enemies had taken the attack, but the herd of black spider monsters didn't stop moving, demonstrating that the battle wasn't over yet and new trials awaited ahead. From excitement about possible failure, Ash took a telescope in his hands and carefully assessed the gravity of the situation. Spiders were advancing. Their number and speed inspired concern. The Spider Queen showed increasing confidence, giving orders to the regiment. She ordered them to form a square, strengthening discipline and organization of her fighters. Heed Evershade was unpleasantly surprised. Their plan to eliminate the Queen hadn't worked, and now he understood that the enemy possessed not only numbers, but also tactical intelligence. Through telescopes, it was visible how spiders headed toward the artillery installations. The situation wasn't going according to plan, and tension among the defenders only grew. Here, Tien had nothing left but to curse and be angry. He realized that the Spider Queen possessed a high level of intelligence and was capable of predicting the opponent's actions. Meanwhile, Chuck ran out of potion vials. He sat confused at the edge of the forest, not understanding how to change the situation and support the fighters at a critical moment. He thought about escape, but this thought seemed shameful for an imperial warrior. Honor and duty held him in place, despite the growing threat and feeling of helplessness. In the distance, a powerful explosion thundered. The soldiers expressed hope and joy, thinking that the strike on the Queen had succeeded. On the battlefield, a mixture of fear and fleeting confidence was felt. Typical Nerd stood on the tower, carefully monitoring the situation. He came to the conclusion that the Queen had again avoided the strike and continued to remain an invincible threat to everyone. Ash was sweating with indignation. The lack of information about the Queen from the training level didn't allow him to understand why she was so difficult to eliminate and what strategies might work. These alarming thoughts were interrupted by the weaponsmith, who reported damage to the cannon. It was capable of making only 3 shots, and this posed a difficult task for the commander. Before the gamer commander stood a difficult goal to eliminate the Queen in just 3 shots. Each shot required precision and strategic calculation. Time was extremely short. At his disposal remained 3 shots and Darkut with his super-seeing abilities. But his eyes had suffered greatly after using the 1,000-mile eye. It was unknown whether he could endure 3 more attempts. The strength of the fortress walls comforted the defenders of the Empire from the spiders, but the approach of monsters still caused horror. Tension grew, and every moment could become fatal. Observing what was happening at the fortress walls, Ash compared the events he encountered in the game with the events of the real battle, trying to find optimal solutions for the team. Typical nerd in the body of the character Ash von Hyde Evershade made decisions quickly and accurately. He gave the order to concentrate all strikes on the monster, minimizing risks for the fortress. The struggle became closer and more dangerous, face to face with the enemy. The fortress walls were damaged, but hadn't collapsed yet. Every action required concentration and instant reaction. Commander Lucas ordered to bring weapons to combat readiness and descend to the first floor. Tien nervously watched what was happening, assessing the team's capabilities and the consequences of each step. Heed Evershade ordered the weaponsmiths to stop panicking and trust the soldiers on the first floor, who had to protect the artillery installations and not allow the enemy to break through. Tien stated that their only task was not to let the monsters to the artillery and kill the Spider Queen. The entire strategy depended on this, and every mistake could be the last. Darkut came to the position and again applied his sniper abilities. In the distance, an explosion thundered, but hitting the Queen again failed. His hands trembled, but his gaze remained focused. Lucas ordered to load the next projectile and not forget about protecting the Emperor's son. The soldiers carried out the command clearly, understanding that any mistake could cost not only their lives, but also the heirs. Soldiers of the enemy army began to climb the fortress wall one by one, but they fell halfway down, which increased the number of victims. Each fall echoed with a dull echo in the defenders' hearts. Observing what was happening, Typical Nerd was beside himself with rage and incomprehension of the gravity of the situation. He felt helpless, as if the rules of the game he had followed had lost all meaning. Playing this game once, he couldn't imagine that real people lived and died here, that death was real, not virtual. This feeling pressed on him with each minute. The weaponsmiths had a fear that the cannon would fail already on the fourth shot. Each touch to the mechanism caused trembling, but there was no need to retreat. No time for hesitation remained. By that time, there was already much blood and victims. Everything around was colored crimson, and Tian still couldn't find a solution to get out of this stalemate situation, watching the chaos. Suddenly, at the fortress walls, a loud human cry was heard. Chuck, the faithful soldier of the prince, stepped forward, calling out the monsters and simultaneously distracting their attention from the walls. Before Chuck could finish speaking, the monsters rushed after him. He ran, leading the crowd of enemies away from the fortress. Every movement required strength and precision. Otherwise, saving the entire group would have been impossible. Such a bold decision to take the blow meant one thing: the pickpocket's survival skill activated. Fate depended on Chuck's bravery and ability to keep enemies moving until the last moment. Before Tian saw on the monitor a warning about canceling activation due to the character's poor health, Chuck was already surrounded by a swarm of spiders. Because of slowness, Ash had to watch with his own eyes the attack of monsters on the big guy Chuck. The spectacle turned out to be frightening and shocking for him. Hyde Evershade was furious at what he saw. He couldn't find words to express hatred toward himself for the lives lost due to incorrectly given orders. He almost fell into apathy, realizing the number of victims through his fault. Disappointment in his own gaming abilities intensified with each minute. Each time he thoughtlessly sent people to their deaths without thinking about the consequences. Now, however, awareness and the desire to correct mistakes came to him. He decided to change the course of events not only in his life, but also in this training level. Understanding mistakes made him reconsider tactics and approach to the game. Besides realizing the wrong approach to orders, Tien understood that monsters couldn't be eliminated with screams, and to win, it would be necessary to act more decisively and methodically. During the battle, Lucas constantly worried about his comrade's health. He was nearby and asked questions, checking if everything was all right with him. His Highness had no time for answers. He stood face to face with the Black Spider, understanding that defeating the army of insects was only possible by exterminating all enemies. At the moment of realizing the situation, Ash began to go toward danger. He decided to fight the spiders in hand-to-hand combat, taking responsibility for the outcome of the battle. Suddenly, from afar, came a loud cry from the weaponsmith. He reported that the fourth projectile was loaded and ready to fire, but Darkut wasn't capable of shooting. Tien asked Darkut again if he was all right and whether he could produce a sniper strike, watching the tension that was already reflected in his wounded eyes. Darkut's eyes were bleeding from strain, but the young fighter said his strength was still enough for the fourth shot so important for victory, which could turn the tide of battle. The Spider Queen stood so close that the fourth shot hit her right in the head, and it would seem should have blown her to small splinters, threatening the entire enemy army. But when the powder screen dissipated after the explosion, the army of Imperial soldiers saw the Spider Queen alive and unharmed, which caused shock and confusion among the defenders. The weak nerves of the weaponsmiths began to fail, and one of them suggested to Hyde Evershade to surrender since the cannon was already unfit for firing and there were no other ideas for exterminating the enemy left. Typical nerd couldn't accept the thought that this was the end and the battle was lost. Fatigue and hopelessness were reflected on his face. Internal resistance forced him to hold on to the end. From the foot of the fortress came desperate voices of soldiers. They shouted that their line of defense was broken. An alarm, fear, and despair gripped the ranks of defenders simultaneously. Darkut's eyes bled with even greater force. He cried from unbearable pain and with annoyance repeated that surely this was the end, feeling complete powerlessness before the unfolding catastrophe. One of the weaponsmiths for the 100th time looked through the telescope and assessed the situation as an impossible resolution of the conflict. Except for surrendering their positions to the enemy, despair grew. The smell of defeat mixed with the smell of blood and hung in the air. Tien was haunted by the feeling that not everything was lost yet, that an unforeseen turn of events was possible and a chance to change the outcome. Hyde Evershade addressed the lookout weaponsmith, reporting damage to the queen's skin. He knew that if the last shot was made, it would be decisive and determine the fate of all. Suddenly, a shot rang out. Deafened by the loud sound, Tien fell into the abyss, not hearing Lucas call out to him. At this moment, the whole world around plunged into chaos and the noise of destruction. It's unknown how much time passed, but opening his eyes, His Highness saw only ruins and smoke. Lucas bent over him, repeating his name, and hope still lived as a warm fire in his chest. The friends rejoiced at the meeting. Mutual concern for their comrade's health was heard in their voices. Every movement, every glance was filled with anxiety and sincere care for each other. Lucas's breathing was ragged from a serious wound. The wound bled profusely, but the young warrior recalled an old game where he promised to become emperor and the coolest person, fulfilling the vow. He remembered his promises to become the most impressive knight, believing in his highness and assuring himself that his lord wouldn't be betrayed. These words were the force that supported both in the darkness of the ruins. Lucas confessed that he was mortally wounded and could no longer be useful. His body weakened, words broke off mid-sentence, and he fell in exhaustion, departing to the other world, leaving the shadow of his promises. Standing over the lifeless body of his subordinate, Ash spoke farewell words. His heart contracted, but his mind sought a path forward, thinking about how to act further and preserve what was still possible. The silence after the battle was heavy. The ruins burned, smoke swirled, but in his highness's eyes determination burned. Fate was unpredictable, but he knew he had to act, despite the loss. Tien realized he was under the artillery installation. Thoughts rushed about, not forming into a coherent picture, like scattered fragments that had lost their connection and logic of what was happening. Having taken several steps, His Highness was able to soberly assess the situation. Darkut and the shooters got away with minor wounds and temporary concussion, which in such conditions seemed almost impossible. Von Hyde Evershade experienced restrained joy from the outcome. However, he didn't understand the reasons for their survival. He was troubled by the question of the disappearance of the queen and her spiders, which didn't give him rest. Suddenly, from under the rubble came Kirem's weak voice. She called out to His Highness as if doubting her own reality and that she had managed to get out alive. Kirem looked extremely exhausted. There was no hope in her face. She warned Tien that her strength was running out and she could no longer hold the blocked entrance for long. At this fateful moment, Ash acutely felt responsibility for everyone. He decided to act at the limit of possibilities and gave the order to load the last remaining projectile. One of the weaponsmiths again pointed out the risk of the cannon itself rupturing. Despite this, His Highness preferred the last shot to doubt and future remorse. For maximum effectiveness, precise aiming was required. The stand was destroyed, so the cannon had to be held manually, taking on all the weight and risk. Hyde Evershade understood that without Darkut's sniper mastery, they couldn't manage. His 1,000-mile eye remained the only chance, which meant it had to be precisely he who should shoot. However, Darkut had lost meaning and faith in success. He didn't perceive what was happening, complaining about fatigue and the desire to follow the friend he had lost many years ago. Ash understood that the guy should be shaken up. He strongly raised his voice at Darkut, explaining that not everything in life is smooth, and to correct at least part of what happened, he needed to stop whining and pull himself together. Tien finally understood that this game didn't obey logic. It went against the rules, which meant it was a prototype of life where every action and mistake were reflected directly, without the right to slack off. His Highness grabbed Darkut by the collar and insisted that abandoning the struggle halfway was extremely disrespectful, both to oneself and to fallen comrades. Fortitude, in his opinion, was the only honor. Hyde Evershade declared in all seriousness that he would fight and develop strategy until his last breath. His screams didn't pick words. They cut through the air as if demanding attention. For the full effect, Ash put a sword to Darkut's throat and showed that if he had no desire to fight for life, he could end it immediately. The pressure was unbearable. The commander yelled for the guy to stop complaining about the departed friend and become a real warrior. For this, he only needed to carry out orders without unnecessary reasoning and doubts. Tien taught not to look for a reason to live in Darkut. It already exists. He's a soldier, and needed as an executor of orders, as a tool that acts without questions, but with full dedication and discipline. The commander's first order after the scolding was to wipe the Spider Queen off the face of the earth. The task was difficult and dangerous, but the only possible one for restoring control. Gradually, the Four Eyes came to his senses. He livened up, realized the responsibility, and promised to be useful for his lord and the empire as a whole, finally feeling his place in the chain of events. The last projectile was loaded, and Ash decided to hold the cannon with his own hands, despite warnings about possible burns. This was a moment of complete determination and personal demonstration of strength. Soldiers came to help the Emperor's son. Together they lifted the cannon which had previously been left in battle and carefully moved it to a safer place to use at the decisive moment. The command was given fire, and the projectile flew out of the cannon with a deafening roar, heading exactly toward the target, not deviating from course and breaking through all obstacles in its path despite the chaos of battle. The projectile flew hundreds of meters, destroying everything in its path, not distinguishing between monsters and obstacles, but ultimately knocked off the Spider Queen's head, finally changing the course of battle and instilling hope in the defenders' hearts. Hyde Evershade woke up in the hospital feeling pain throughout his body. Every muscle ached with pain, but this also meant he had survived and his life had been saved despite serious wounds. At the table in the ward, In the role of a nurse sat Kirem. She quietly told the news of the last 3 days that the patient had missed while unconscious, carefully watching his reaction and mood. Kirem spoke embarrassedly, not hiding joy internally, fearing that His Highness might not wake up after such a difficult battle and after the shot that almost became the last for him. Tian looked at Kirem with tenderness, surprised by her presence here. He thought she could have died from wounds, but was glad she was nearby and could support him in this difficult moment of recovery. Reinforcements took care of the bodies of the dead, carefully clearing the battle area of debris so no one would get hurt and they could safely continue operations and recovery after the battle. Kirem worried about the injuries and wounds covering the Imperial Son's body. She suggested visiting holy places after discharge so soul and body could receive peace and strengthening after what they experienced. Complete recovery doesn't mean healing all scars and wounds, but this isn't a reason for concern. The main thing is life is preserved and ahead, there's time to recover and regain strength for future affairs. For typical nerd, who temporarily transformed into Ash von Hyde Evershade, it was hard to observe Kirem's current state. She sat immobilized in a wheelchair, and this wounded him. The girl, with a smile on her lips, told about terrible events that limited her capabilities. Every word she shared seemed even more painful for typical nerd. Kirem reported pleasant news about the survivors. Even those whom Ash considered dead remained alive. Among them were Lucas, Darkut, herself, and His Highness, which instilled hope. Each of the survivors realized that out of 200 soldiers, only 9 managed to be saved. This, of course, was joyful, but couldn't be considered a manifestation of professionalism. Kirem tried to comfort typical nerd. He understood that despite the transformation into Ash von Hyde Evershade, all the blame for what happened lay on him as a gamer. The girl carefully chose words to convince His Highness that no one knew about the monster attack. Consequently, no one could stop the soldiers so the war wouldn't begin. Suddenly, the doors of the ward burst open with a crash. An excited but joyful Lucas entered, his face glowing with hope, and his movements showed impatience to learn about the Lord's condition. He approached Ash and began to caringly inquire about his well-being. He asked if everything was all right. If there was pain, his attention was focused only on the character's health. To shift the topic, typical nerd turned the conversation to Lucas's condition. It was important for him to know how the wounds had healed to make sure he was completely recovered after previous events. As proof that he was now completely healthy, Lucas straightened to full height, chest forward, legs shoulder-width apart. He demonstrated strength and confidence, feeling completely recovered. Lucas, besides worrying about his lord, didn't come empty-handed. The warrior brought a carefully compiled list of those who fell in battle, which touched the heart of everyone present. His Highness, despite the pain of loss, emphasized that everything possible had been done to save the maximum number of people, assessing the soldiers' bravery and loyalty. Having received information about the location of the bodies, Ash von Hyde Evershade decided to personally go to the front positions to examine the bodies of the fallen, demonstrating the commander's care and responsibility. Kirem was against such ill-considered actions, considering them dangerous. However, she understood that the commander had to personally see the consequences of battles to make further decisions. Tennessee, despite his previous gaming involvement, understood that what seemed like a game had now become cruel reality, and that the commander bore the blame for the soldiers' deaths. Without delay, Lucas and His Highness headed to the front. Since Hyde Evershade couldn't yet stand firmly on his feet, Lucas took him on his shoulders, carrying him with patience and reverence. When the subordinate delivered the commander to the place where the fallen lay, with surprise they noticed a human figure in the distance. It was Darkut, who also saw them. Darkut rejoiced at the opportunity to meet combat comrades again. All 3 were silent, paying tribute to the fallen, feeling simultaneously the heaviness of losses and quiet joy of meeting. After a few minutes, questions began. Tian was interested in the state of Darkut's eyes, and the 4 eyes reported that vision was gradually recovering, causing quiet relief among those present. Darkut's embarrassment knew no bounds when Hyde Evershade thanked him for going around the battlefield blind and for using magic to heal the wounded. His Highness offered Darkut a generous reward, freeing him from further battles. Darkut looked into the distance, assessing the situation, and remained silent, accepting the offer. The guy was occupied by the question of the creators of monsters and the possibility of getting rid of them. But there was no answer. The sniper turned face to face with the commander, expressing readiness to continue service. He didn't want to retire, striving to work under His Highness's command without hesitation. Tian didn't hide his joy when the young soldier decided to remain in his former position. The gamer, embodied in the character, sincerely admired Darkut's courage and inner determination. On the battlefield, among corpses, typical nerd understood that the situation was critical. There was no other strategy at the time of decision-making, and the choice had to be made independently. Having placed responsibility for all who died, Hyde Evershade began to understand the direction of further actions. Each step required extreme concentration and internal discipline. He ordered that after the funeral ceremony of souls, Lucas should take the bodies to the wasteland and bury them there, ensuring dignified rest for each fallen. His Highness planned to arrange a military cemetery on the wasteland and, annually, in the second month, honor the memory of the fallen, forming a tradition of honoring heroes. At that moment, Tien was completely himself, realizing that he acted not only for the fallen, but also for atonement for lives taken in a seemingly harmless game. The gamer, being a game character, gave Lucas a promise that mistakes wouldn't be repeated, and he wouldn't lose, demonstrating determination and striving to correct the past. Having finished dealing with the repose of bodies, His Highness together with subordinates, soldiers Lucas and Darkut, returned to the military base, ready for new trials and duties. 3 days after staying at the military base, the commander gave the order to return to the fortress. Typical nerd, who completed the training, found himself at the 5th level and could choose a class. Tien was dissatisfied with his game character and stat distribution. The ability to choose any status slightly flattered his gaming ego, but doubts didn't leave him. Of all available statuses, Tien could only choose Rookie Commander. This meant he would have to go through the entire level without knowing all the character's capabilities, which caused alarm. Typical nerd sat in front of the monitor, not daring to make a choice, although the situation required a quick decision. Thoughts were confused, and time continued to move inexorably forward. The gamer's reflections were interrupted by the character, Lucas's joyful cry. He reported they had arrived at the place, in the fortress called Crossroads, a defense point and strategic object. The fortress's purpose was simultaneously simple and complex. It held back attacks of monsters that periodically advanced from the south, requiring constant readiness and attention. When monsters retreated, soldiers were sent on other assignments. In their place, the fortress recruited veteran warriors of various nationalities, replenishing forces and garrison diversity. Over decades, the fortress expanded infrastructure and turned into a city of a million. It received the official name Fortress City, becoming the front line of defense against monsters. However, Tien saw a different name in this place, more accurate in his opinion. He called it Grave City, meaning the recklessness of mercenaries gathering from all over the world. Thoughts about the future and dangers overflowed typical nerd. He understood that the choice of class and rookie commander status would determine his further fate on the Crossroads front. Entering the city, typical nerd caught himself thinking that while playing at the monitor, he hadn't suspected how huge and poor this metropolis was. In Ash's person, he decided to lead this area. The residents of Grave City met the commander with displeased faces. Ash understood the reason for their behavior, because people knew the army died due to his ill-considered command. But the commander's sad thoughts gave way to jubilation. He foresaw such an attitude of people toward his person and prepared a surprise for them, which, as he hoped, would change their opinion of him. In the convoy were carts filled to the brim with magical crystals extracted from dead monsters at the battle site. This supply should have impressed the residents and demonstrated strength and generosity. Typical nerd, an experienced gamer, understood that winning any battle depended on local residents' support. He had to establish relations with them and earn trust before acting further. In his plans, Ash strived to earn a good reputation. He intended to offer the city's residents generous donations in the form of gold coins, hoping thus to win the inhabitants' hearts. Thanks to the strategic plan, typical nerd already knew how and with what he would eventually strengthen his influence in this metropolis, preparing the ground for future leadership and respect from the population. The carriage stopped. Lucas opened the door and reported the journey was over. They had arrived home, and Ash carefully got out of the carriage, anticipating what he would see. Before his eyes appeared a beautiful mansion of several floors with its own garden. The building's architecture and well-maintained territories amazed with their scale and elegance, demonstrating the owner's success and prosperity. And here, typical nerd couldn't restrain his admiration. Even in his wildest dreams, he couldn't imagine such a house for himself, especially obtained in the process of reaching the highest level through the game, which added joy. In the huge mansion, Von Hyde Evershade met a joyful and excited person who called him either Lord or Highness, apologizing for untimely formulations. This emotional oddball was named Idar. In the game, he was listed as city manager. He conducted all administrative affairs, and now Tien had to cooperate with him, being in Evershade's body. Having gone inside, Von Hyde gave Lucas orders to rest and create comfortable conditions for soldiers' rest so everyone would be ready for upcoming events. Lucas tried to object regarding his rest, but His Highness stopped him with a hand gesture and gave the command to return to duties tomorrow, showing determination and order. Tien rejoiced at Lucas's obedience and went up the luxurious stairs following Adar, enjoying the feeling of power and anticipating future actions. Idar flung open the door of one of the rooms. It was a huge bathroom, in the center of which stood a filled jacuzzi. Von Hyde felt fatigue and the desire to wash away the smell of war. In anticipation of blissful rest, he told Idar he was free and began to remove his outer clothing, feeling relief after long tense events. Despite the Lord's order, the servant didn't leave, but with a sinister smile continued the conversation, declaring he knew about Tien's completion of training and introduced himself as the game creator. Such an unprepossessing little manservant gloated because he managed to fool everyone and everything, enjoying his small triumph over masters and players simultaneously. The game creator and city manager, Idar's gloating didn't last long and was cut off by a strong blow to the jaw, returning the situation to an unpredictable and tense order. Typical Nerd was beside himself with rage. He couldn't believe that the ignorant shorty, whom he knew the entire game as administrator and partner, turned out to be the director of Empire Defense. The ignorant shorty suddenly fell to his knees before the gamer and began to apologize, realizing all the seriousness of his position and the consequences of meeting the person who had kept the game under control. But Typical Nerd had already entered a rush and couldn't stop. He delivered a series of powerful blows to the game creator, releasing accumulated anger and indignation for all the years of struggle. With a mouth swollen from beatings, the servant manager barely audibly uttered apologies to his best gamer in the entire history of the game's existence, realizing helplessness before the rage. Later, when Tien got tired of beating him, the director raised both hands, showing readiness for peaceful coexistence. A conversation about causes and consequences of what happened started between them. The director explained that in an attempt to achieve the best ending for the world he created, he restarted the game many times but didn't achieve the desired result, and therefore attracted the best gamer. The creator told how he deliberately turned the world into a game so gamers from all over the world would seek the opportunity to create the perfect ending, which no one had yet managed to achieve. The director of Empire Defense honestly admitted that he himself hadn't found the ideal ending, but was able to pass the Hellish Man of Steel level, which required outstanding dexterity and strategy. Believing in the incredible capabilities of an ordinary mortal gamer, the director decided to embed him in the game from within, providing control and responsibility for the development of the virtual world. Hearing this, Tien couldn't restrain himself again. He shouted offensive words and accusations, pointing to the game owner's mistakes, sending him to training and making him a commander, demonstrating power and superiority. Frightened by the gamer's rage, the director Shorty partially admitted his mistakes in character placement, but simultaneously asked to hear his explanations. While Typical Nerd froze waiting for explanations, the director began to quickly state the essence of all participants' presence here and now, trying not to miss a single detail. The game creator promised that upon finding the best ending, Typical Nerd would be generously rewarded with fulfillment of wishes and would return to the familiar world after completing the game. Not believing his own ears, Typical Nerd tried to agree on the prize amount and named the most desired for himself, $1 billion in cash, as if testing the director's reaction. The shorty manager laughed loudly, covering his mouth with his hands, amazed at such a limited sum and modest wish of the player, adding that he could give much more and fulfill any dream. While Typical Nerd was lost, choosing which dream exactly to ask to be fulfilled, the director already anticipated what the gamer would demand upon reaching the most correct game ending. The director of the game Empire Defense claimed that as long as there's a cherished dream in the heart, a person is capable of anything for its realization, turning any trial into an opportunity to prove their strength. This remark provoked a question from the gamer: why a person with such capabilities couldn't himself come up with a universal ending capable of completing the game ideally and without outside help. And here, the shorty manager honestly admitted that in the world where he was located, his capabilities were limited in relation to fulfilling his own wishes, and therefore he had to seek help from outside. For this reason, they waited many years for a player who would pass all levels to embed him in the common cause and improve the unique game, turning it into something more than just entertainment. Tien had one main question left: what would happen after death? The answer turned out to be logical. Death can't mean anything but the end. The end of everything will come inevitably. The director made a cunning face, emphasizing that an experienced gamer, which Typical Nerd was, should understand the rules and be ready for everything. A minute later, the shorty reported the possibility of sending the player to Earth, to his real world, if he accepted such an offer. The director put Tien before a choice: continue an ordinary life on Earth or remain in the game, risking his life for a successful ending. The gamer decided that having passed all levels of the mega difficult game, it would be stupid to simply return home. He wanted to find the universal ending and use his experience. Tien decisively confirmed readiness to play again, reminding that he was doing this for the prize he would ask from the director for winning the game. The professional player's answer pleased the director, and he agreed to help Typical Nerd in everything, preparing to support him at every stage. Before accepting help, the four-eyed ignoramus received the first order: sell all crystals and bring the money, which immediately put the director in difficulty. The director didn't like the idea of selling crystals. He tried to evade the deal, but Tien insisted on his rights and repeated the order, demonstrating determination. Having agreed to deal with selling the crystals, Idar still felt curiosity about where the gamer was going to spend such a huge amount of money, watching the development of events. The morning of the next day brought clear light, and Tien observed through the window a yard filled with carts of gold coins. The entire view struck with its luxury and wealth, which seemed boundless. After breakfast and a short rest, His Highness together with Lucas headed to the Mercenary Guild, anticipating meeting people who could become part of his future army. A strange commotion reigned in the establishment. Visitors, surrounded by the smell of alcohol, looked with displeasure. The atmosphere was thick and gloomy, every gesture accompanied by quiet grumbling. Ash von Hyde Evershade held himself confidently. His presence instantly attracted everyone's attention, and he made it clear he had come to hire people for imperial service. The guests gradually quieted down, watching the two stately young men. Hyde Evershade continued to explain with a commanding voice the purposes of his visit, assessing the local contingent. He carefully looked over those present, trying to determine who was capable of becoming a worthy warrior. In his eyes could be read strict assessment and hidden disappointment. Having passed into the far room, Tien noticed a woman at the bar counter. She sat straight without turning around and met His Highness's gaze with quiet respect and calm. The woman was older than middle age, gray hair gathered in a ponytail, and a black eye patch covered one eye. There were many medals on her chest. Their shine emphasized high rank and experience. Ash sat down nearby, wanting to establish contact with a person close in spirit. The old woman introduced herself as Torona, Lightning Enchantress of SR rank, which immediately attracted his attention and respect. He noticed the unusual form of his interlocutor, never seen before. Torona explained that she had served the Empire and the form was old but honorable, preserving the memory of past battles and merits. The lady of advanced years had served as captain of the 2nd Squadron. After retirement, she continued to act as a mercenary, combining experience and harshness in combat operations. She carefully examined the newcomers and noted that cannon fodder was needed by any army. Her tone and boldness instantly made an impression on all present in the hall. Lucas restrained irritation, internally boiling from the lady's impudence. Arguing with a veteran of military service wasn't in his style, and he preferred silence. The lady in uniform told in detail that everyone had heard about the army's losses and that even mercenaries wouldn't go to certain death for large sums. Hyde Evershade approached the matter decisively and suggested everyone name the price for their own life, emphasizing that everyone already sells it for pennies. Ash took Torona under the arm. His smile was sneering and confident. He reported that he knew about her service and participation in embezzling funds, which caused tension. The game character typical nerd beamed with a smile, listing Torona's vicious qualities: corruption, smuggling, and shameful dismissal, enjoying the moment. Continuing to press on his interlocutor, Ash clarified whether she wasn't ashamed to still wear the uniform, making her feel her own defeat and moral pressure. The Lightning Enchantress was a war veteran, excluded for exceeding authority, but her heroism and unsurpassability weren't questioned even after retirement. The lady asked Hyde Evershade to choose words carefully. He immediately got to the point and asked how much she valued her own life in monetary equivalent. She stated the price of 200,000. He'd immediately doubled it. When she objected, he emphasized that status and capabilities allowed such expenses without harm to the budget. After a successful deal, Tien announced that all who value life above money could calmly disperse and return to their usual duties at home. He added that those wishing to serve for worthy remuneration could come today in the evening to the Western Wasteland, where recruitment to his army would begin. On the way home, combat comrades Lucas and Hyde Evershade decided to stop by the church to pay respect and conduct necessary healing rituals. There, a rite was performed over His Highness's wound, and the bandage fixed the healing. The process went painlessly, and those present appreciated the healer's mastery. The rite was performed by the local saint named Meggy, a hidden heroine of R rank who possessed unique abilities in healing and supporting combat teams. After the procedure, Hyde Evershade made the decision to recruit Meggy, planning to include her in the team in the coming days, considering her skills and potential. The commander of the Imperial Army brought a large sum to the temple to pay mercenaries, demonstrating the seriousness of intentions and the need to motivate fighters. Meggy gathered all potential soldiers in the church and gave a motivating speech on behalf of His Highness, Darkut, and Lucas, strengthening the spirit of newcomers before service. When evening came, all those wishing to earn on the front line gathered on the Western Wasteland, ready for action, for discipline, and for trials awaiting ahead. On the wasteland, two ceremonies took place simultaneously: initiation into the Empire's army and a funeral with honors for soldiers fallen on the front line. The atmosphere was solemn and tense. The large-scale event was accompanied by choral singing of the national anthem and prayers for the souls of those who didn't return home, creating a feeling of sacred ritual for all present. Families of the dead received generous compensation. Rumors of such unprecedented generosity quickly spread throughout the city, attracting public attention to the authorities' care for their soldiers. All events were part of a public presentation for the people, aimed at raising the fighting spirit of rookie mercenaries and strengthening people's faith in the might of the army and commanders. Ash von Hyde Evershade came out to the people and made an impression on those gathered. Some saw a great leader in him, others considered him strange, but attention to him was complete and unchanged. Typical nerd, being in the body of a game character, spoke about high risks of service, mortality, and duty to the homeland, trying to convey the seriousness of what was happening to the listeners. He added that the cemetery, where all present had gathered, would soon be rapidly expanding, emphasizing the scale of future losses and the seriousness of war. To enhance the significance of his words, Ash noted that the deaths of mercenaries were more important than their inaction, showing that activity and courage were valued above all, even individual lives. After a pause, His Highness reported that expenses for funerals and compensation cost him dearly, so he would cherish each soldier, showing care and responsibility for his people. He addressed the mercenaries with a request to try to survive, return from war, and see their relatives, emphasizing the importance of personal preservation and responsibility for the future. Upon completion of the speech, Tian reflected that simple people thought and said about him behind his back, but quickly noted that others' opinions couldn't change his internal position and goals. Since the city lord, commander, and typical nerd were one person, his task remained to make the people believe in him, strengthening authority and influence through demonstration of strength and care. Before the start of the first level, Tian activated the teleportation gates, launching the process that opened a portal to the dungeon under the lake, providing access to enemy territory and new opportunities. Now, a free passage appeared to the enemy's rear, allowing reconnaissance and planning strategic actions without direct threat of attack, opening new tactical possibilities. In the game, there are levels where the enemy doesn't attack, and the player can look around, study the features of monsters and terrain, ensuring preparation before active combat missions. Tian often recalled his training, skills, and experience that he managed to achieve at each stage, understanding that preparation and practice made him stronger and more confident in actions. The beginning of the game fascinated typical nerd. Anticipation of battles and confidence in passing levels without losing friends created excitement and a feeling of control over what was happening. For Lucas, everything happening was reality, so Tian, in the image of His Highness, explained to him the rules of the game, showing the difference between game capabilities and real events, ensuring understanding of the situation. Lucas listened carefully, quickly grasped the essence of what was happening. He was especially interested in the possibility of scouting the enemy base before going to the second level, which gave strategic advantage and confidence. Every step in the game was calculated, and preparation and analysis of the situation allowed Tian to act thoughtfully, minimizing losses and optimizing actions on the battlefield, creating a feeling of complete power over events. Typical nerd was surprised by Lucas's behavior. He only recently understood the game rules, but doesn't ask unnecessary questions, only carries out his commander's orders following precise instructions. To the question asked, Lucas answered that he's a soldier of his commander and has no right to ask questions. His task is only to carry out orders of His Highness, not deviating from set goals. Ash had no reason not to trust Lucas. They both teleported to the dock by the lake, where the gloomy atmosphere intensified tension and forced them to act with caution. Contemplating the terrible pictures of the lake and dungeon, both comrades explored the area and noticed they weren't alone here, and danger could appear suddenly, without warning. At the bottom of the lake, where the water suddenly parted in two directions, stood living armor. These were monsters more terrible than those Tian was ready to meet on the first level, and the situation was becoming critical. While His Highness cursed, assessing all the hopelessness of the situation, Lucas analyzed what was happening. He calculated the threat, thought through possible options for action, and maintained composure. Ash turned pale, and his faithful soldier Lucas didn't understand for what reason such a strong gamer felt so bad, because outwardly, the situation was controllable, but the Lord's emotions betrayed fear and fatigue. When typical nerd played this game at home in front of the monitor, seeing living armor on the horizon, he reloaded the game. This process was repeated many times, reflecting the intransigence of game mechanics. This was repeated 741 times, because confronting living armor was only possible from the middle of the game when you managed to acquire necessary statuses, tools, and skills which made the encounter fatal. From anger and lack of solution, it seemed to the Lord that someone was deliberately preventing him from passing this game again. The situation went beyond the usual control, and emotions turned into irritation and despair. Hyde Evershade made the decision to return through the same portal through which he and Lucas had entered. They left the dangerous territory, but understood that challenges weren't over and new difficulties lay ahead. With a certain note of despair, His Highness noted that he would try to do everything in his power to pass this game again. Strategy required careful planning and resource mobilization. Having returned to his estate, the Lord demanded from Idar a report on the state of military personnel in the city. The game director reported that there were 526 men available to send to the front, which was insufficient. Such a small number of potential rookie soldiers drove Ash out of himself. He regretted spending so much money, but expectations didn't justify hopes, and now, new methods were needed to achieve victory. Idar added that in this city, all mercenaries had already come into service to the Lord. But this was little, even with those 500 civilians. Von Hyde ordered to hire soldiers from neighboring cities to strengthen the army. Ash ordered Idar to send a telegram to the Empire's capital about the state of emergency and activation of monsters to prepare central forces and warn of the approaching threat, leaving no time for delay. After thinking a bit, His Highness gave the order to summon to the city all specialists in alchemy, carpentry, and blacksmiths, or to conscript them into the army, to mobilize human and professional resources in an emergency situation. To which the director of Empire Defense answered that if so much labor force was withdrawn from production, the process of cutting magical crystals would stop, and this would create critical failures in army supply and resource management. And here, the character of typical nerd, in whose body he was stuck, couldn't restrain his emotions. With a shout repeated to Idar directly in his face his order, stress and tension reached their limit, and there were no alternatives to actions left. Tien understood that the second time he would have to pass this game with even greater difficulty and decided to take more radical measures. He went all in and accepted the status of rookie commander, preparing for trials he had previously avoided. Messages began appearing on the screen that the gamer hadn't seen last time. Passing all levels was accompanied by debuffs that reduced by 50% stat growth and access to weapons. Ash von Hyde Evershade's position changed in a matter of seconds. It changed not for the better, which caused irritation and internal discomfort in him. Attack totem, defense totem, super buffer, main command, group synergy, all these were new abilities that he hadn't had before and didn't understand how to use them in battle. Later, having calmed down, the gamer realized that the acquired skills were beneficial to him. Now, he could reward allies with part of the same abilities he possessed himself. The new level contained a class that provided the ability to control all participants simultaneously. This gave Ash special satisfaction and strengthened the feeling of control over the situation. The next morning, the director called the commander to the council hall. 4 bound people were waiting for him there, leaders of work groups whose members refused to enter service by order. Among the captives were brave men who weren't afraid to express their dissatisfaction with the situation in the city directly to the Lord. Their courage was noticeable and inspired respect. Such impudent behavior of subordinates was immediately stopped by Ash von Hyde Evershade. He shouted, shamed and threatened, demonstrating absolute superiority and control over the situation. Having assessed the inequality of statuses, the work group leaders agreed to the proposed conditions. They even brought their apologies to His Highness for the disagreement shown. As compensation for unauthorized actions against workers and for successful conclusion of negotiations, soldiers were offered 20% of crystals obtained in battle. For such generosity, the commander demanded unquestioning execution of orders from people's leaders, including production of weapons if the situation and strategic goals required it. Money and interest played a role. Workers agreed to conditions without hesitation and hurried to get to work, understanding that the city's future fate depended on this. Time passed, events developed not in the best way. 2 days remained before the start of the game, and living armor, already on the way, should have arrived at the city and strengthened the defense. Ash gathered his closest associates and explained the seriousness of the situation. Everyone was ready for battle, but the Lord clarified that he would give step-by-step instructions for further actions. Lucas received the order to improve military training skills among soldiers and train newcomers from scratch, creating the foundation for a disciplined and prepared team. Kiram didn't stay aside. The Lord gave her a position that didn't require physical activity and appointed her head of restoring protective artifacts, providing strategic support. The Lord didn't forget about the former captain of the 2nd Squadron Torona. He appointed the elderly money lover as a city civil servant for life, securing certain administrative functions for her. In addition, Torona received the position of commander of Special Forces troops. She also achieved a promise to raise salary depending on merits, which motivated her to work effectively. Darkwood was armed with a crossbow of ordinary strength, 30 out of 30 without bonuses. But in the sniper's hands, such a weapon sometimes proved more effective than a mana cannon, thanks to skill in handling it. When His Highness inquired why Darkut now didn't wear glasses, the sniper explained that he used them for respectability, but even without them, he saw well enough to carry out orders without mistakes. After checking the technical condition of city communications and structures, damage to the southern fortress wall was discovered. The director received a reprimand from Ash for negligence. Lack of money and time, and then the absence of need for repair became justifications for negligence. Idar received a reprimand and an order to bring the wall in order without delays. His Highness ordered carpenters in a short time to build a high and long wooden wall, even if they considered it useless when monsters attacked. For the remaining 2 days, preparation for the start of the game and monster attack went lively and productively. Such a pace of work greatly pleased the Lord and raised fighting spirit. Time flew quickly, and only half an hour remained before the start of battle. Lookouts noticed enemy activity on the horizon and the approach of potential threat to the fortress. A horde of living armor rapidly led the offensive and with each minute approached the walls. Tension in the fortress intensified with each second. The commander of the Imperial Army convinced everyone that such a strong army would easily exterminate the enemy, although he himself internally doubted the success of the upcoming battle. He shouted optimistic slogans, was proud of soldiers' physical preparation and abundance of newest weapons, although these facts were greatly exaggerated to raise spirits. Ash's main task was for the army to trust the Lord and unquestioningly obey his orders in critical moments of battle and strategic actions. When everyone hoped for him, Ash in turn counted on each one individually. To pass the first level, he needed Tarona's help, the Magic Master. An expensive fighter in a skirt entered battle. Lightning Mage Tarona, together with her students, ready to apply their skills and strategic abilities against enemies. The predictability of monsters' actions played into Tarona's hands. She directed them into a trap and blinded them with an electric discharge to scatter the enemy's formation discipline. The sorceress's first skill scattered marks on enemy targets, and the second directed them for destruction. Hyde Evershade watched the battle, admiring Tarona's mastery. Despite successful repulsion of the attack, Tarona's unit received an order to retreat. The enemy's numbers significantly exceeded the defenders' numbers. Living armor reached the fortress walls. But besides the usual structures, they encountered wooden shields, which created congestion and slowed the army's advance. When at the foot of the fortress, the Legion sought a way out of encirclement, Ash gave the command to open fire on the enemy concentration to inflict maximum damage with minimum losses. From all cannons of the Imperial Army, projectiles flew out and fell on enemies' heads like deadly fire rain, breaking through armor and creating chaos in the ranks of attackers. Despite the success of the first operation, everyone understood this was only part of the battle and new attacks awaited ahead, requiring concentration and precise interaction of troops. At this stage, Kirem's help was needed. By the Lord's order, she activated the gravity field artifact to slow enemies' movement and facilitate counterattack. A minute later, Ash ordered Lucas to bring ballistas to combat readiness. Lucas immediately gave orders to soldiers and monitored preparation for the next volley. It was indicated to aim at living armor's chests. Crossfire of artifacts and ballistics inflicted crushing blows, destroying enemy ranks and leaving no chances for resistance. Darkut received the order to exterminate all uninvited guests attacking from the left side of the fortress. His shots hit the target with amazing accuracy, bringing tangible effect. The 1,000-mile eye functioned again, providing accurate data for striking the enemy. Darkut hit targets with enviable accuracy, increasing defense effectiveness. Crossfire at the fortress's foot caused mass destruction. The opponent lost ranks and fighting spirit, notwithstanding the pressure created by organized attack. Observing his soldiers' dedication, Tien felt joy. Work results were impressive, and efficiency was achieved in a short time, causing pride for the fighters. However, anticipation of victory didn't last long. Among the living armor appeared their boss, violating the game's order, appearing ahead of schedule, and instantly changing the situation on the field. Even experienced soldiers came in horror, noticing the boss. For all participants, this game turned into cruel reality, where every mistake could cost lives. The monster's appearance caused fear not only in people but also in horses. The boss's appearance sharply reduced the fortress's defense, forcing soldiers to seek new survival strategies. Analyzing the worsening situation, Ash understood it was time to retreat. The situation was rapidly getting out of control, requiring instant decisions to save the troops. Confusion didn't last long. Ash gave the order to protect Tarona, considering her the most powerful weapon of flesh and blood, capable of changing the course of battle at the right moment. Artillerymen, gripped by fear before the boss, were losing their minds. Fire activity decreased, but Ash managed to restore bombardment by order to hold positions. Tarona's fortitude inspired her subordinates. They fought desperately, fighting with all their might, despite fear, fatigue, and superior enemy forces. Nevertheless, the first line of defense was lost. Living armor broke through forward, creating a threat for remaining fortress defenders and threatening further advance. Before the former captain of the 2nd Squadron stood living armor, their smell of mold and rust irritated and weakened the fighting spirit of the elderly lady, reducing the effectiveness of magical attacks. She felt weakness. Lightning brought almost no effect. It seemed the situation was hopeless, for the first time causing in her a desire to surrender or cry from helplessness. Unexpectedly, a young man with a spear appeared nearby. He didn't flinch from fear and supported the experienced lady, advising to continue attacking with magic, providing temporary advantage. The mercenary cleared space, scattering living armor, creating protection for Torona. However, after some time, he was struck by monsters, leaving allies without support. Standing over the fallen mercenary, Torona regretted delaying with mana for a powerful shot. The opportunity to change the battle's outcome was slipping away with each moment, reducing chances for victory. Although the advice was already late, Torona still gave it. She noted that the mercenary should have been kept away from mages and better to avoid service in the army, despite all rules and laws of war. Standing face to face with monsters, Torona felt powerlessness and inevitability of death. Her heart pounded, body tensed, fear constrained every movement. It seemed there was no way out. Suddenly a sound was heard, warning of someone else's presence. It was Lucas, who descended into the death zone from the fortress wall, where his skill activated, the commander's unbending will. Lucas's skill gave immunity against madness and spread to all allies. The Empire's soldiers, thanks to this, lost fear, gaining strength and confidence in the face of danger. A rescue detachment sent by Lucas himself by the commander's order came to help Torona. The commander at this time was engaged in organizing soldiers and resuming fire strike on the enemy to hold positions. Despite her age, Torona maintained physical form and nimbly jumped on the horse that Lucas brought. They rushed away from monsters, feeling danger gradually retreat. Lucas, on the go, regretted not arriving earlier. He felt guilt and responsibility for Torona, having to cope with the threat alone while he was unavailable. Thanks to the new status, Ash managed to restore control over the death zone. Lucas and Torona returned to the fortress safe and sound, avoiding death and serious injuries. This success cost typical nerd 4 soldiers and a number of destructions. He didn't account for panic among people and animals, which led to undesirable consequences for the fortress's defense. The death zone didn't function ideally. Around remained fire, screams, and signs of approaching enemy regiment, creating tense atmosphere and threat for remaining defenders. Despite unexpected events, the Lord understood he controlled the situation. He maintained cold calculation, managing events, not allowing circumstances to manage him. Lucas carefully watched Torona, trying to maintain politeness, although internally he felt irritation. The old soldier in a skirt pointed to the commander's mistakes and regretted her weakness. The enemy destroyed the death zone. Artillerymen with Darkut received the order to cease bombardment, which caused alarm among defenders. Imperial soldiers began preparing for a new threat, assessing enemy forces. The approach of enemies intensified fears that living armor could overcome the fortress walls. Defenders carefully monitored every movement of monsters, trying to anticipate their maneuvers. For close combat, a detachment was brought to combat readiness, where physical strength determined the outcome. Soldiers checked weapons and developed tactics, preparing for brutal battle. Meanwhile, living armor began ascending the fort's walls. Above them already met the prepared Empire's army, ready to meet the opponent and repel the attack. As soon as enemy heads appeared on the horizon, artillerymen with mercenaries began dropping technical debris on them, concrete pieces, reinforcement, and other heavy objects. Most monsters lost consciousness and fell down, receiving mortal wounds. The rest continued to climb, ignoring pain, and threateningly advanced toward fortress defenders. The Lord didn't lose hope for victory. Feverishly sought solution through the game's internal content. Ultimately, necessary group reorganization was found, which could change the course of battle. The situation with fortress defense worsened. Hand-to-hand combat began. Soldiers fought with their last strength, trying to hold positions and not let the opponent capture strategic points. Lucas gave the command not to leave positions. The only chance to survive in this battle for all defenders was not to surrender and continue fighting to the end. By this moment, Kurem received from Ash the order to bring the speed artifact to activation mode. This accelerated allies' actions by 5%, which was enough to control the monsters. At this stage, a cumulative skill was connected to Lucas, and his strength grew with each enemy killed. New capabilities increased effectiveness, but the opponent remained dangerous and cruel. Despite connecting abilities, Von Hyde Evershade understood he had more losses than the enemy. The Emperor's army was suffering defeat, and front lines gradually retreated, unable to contain the onslaught. Having assessed the worsening situation, Darkut and Torona returned to the front, and the Lord feverishly searched for functions in the game system capable of reducing losses and decreasing enemy numbers. The solution came through Kirem. She had to use all the power of her magic. The girl felt fatigue and complained about weakening mana, but Ash's promise to raise salary motivated her. Lucas cut monsters with a sword, and Kirem burned them with magical flame. Their joint actions produced an impressive effect, leaving behind fiery and bloody traces of destruction. To the foot of the ancient fortress of Grave City fell charred bodies of monsters, blocking the main entrance. Despite this, it was premature to rejoice. The threat remained too close. The commander addressed the closest circle and reminded that the enemy couldn't be considered weakened. Opponents maintained combat capability, and their strength in the person of the boss remained a significant threat. When the boss's approach was noticed, the commander-in-chief gave the order to artillerymen not to cease fire. Each volley was calculated to slow the target and create safe distance for troops. Allies concentrated on coordinated actions. Kirem's magic, Lucas's combat skills, and artillery fire created powerful pressure on the enemy, gradually changing the course of battle in their favor. It was time for Kirem to activate the magic multiplier. The third R-rank artifact flashed, amplifying the energy flow, and its power instantly transferred to Torona, changing the battle balance. Torona rushed into the very epicenter of battle. She came not empty-handed to humanity's most dangerous enemy, carrying with her a clot of pure electrical energy. Darkut received an equally fateful mission. Using the Soul Core, he shot from the combat installation directly at the target, leaving no doubt about the strike's accuracy. Joy from successful attack didn't last long. Typical Nerd noticed that the enemy was only partially hit, and a magical sword appeared in the boss's hand. If the boss touched the city fortress wall with this sword, the entire structure would collapse, burying defenders and depriving the city of the last line of defense. The commander-in-chief's nerves were finally shaken. In the midst of confrontation, he began to shout orders even louder, trying to maintain control over the situation. When the living armor's boss raised the sword, intending to strike the wall, Torona, without delay, directed her lightning directly at the target. The spectacle proved mesmerizing. The long-standing and most powerful enemy burned, whose existence had inspired fear and hopelessness for many years. In one instant, Ash realized mortal danger. The thought of escape flashed too late, and he didn't manage to transmit the order. Several meters of freefall ended unexpectedly successfully. Lucas and the Lord remained safe and unharmed, breaking out of the abyss. The main structure's wall of the city still bore traces of the strike. The fortress was partially destroyed, stone crumbled, reminding of victory's price and how close collapse had been. The Ghost Knight, boss of living armor, no longer existed. The level was passed. However, typical Nerd replayed in memory again and again the moment of the monster's final defeat. Victory over monsters came hard to the detachment. It cost heavy losses, but remained long-awaited, hard-won, and therefore especially significant for each surviving fighter. Soldiers of the Imperial Army examined the battle's consequences and couldn't fully realize how they managed to surpass the enemy considered the most powerful of those known. Battle tension slowly left faces, conversations, and townspeople's everyday life. They learned anew to rejoice in simple things and cautiously built plans for the future. In the city, they arranged a victory celebration with dances, contests, treats, and abundance of drinks. His Highness paid for all expenses, wanting to thank people for fortitude. Music poured from all sides. Adults and children's laughter sounded. Streets transformed beyond recognition, and almost no noticeable traces remained of recent horrors. Unlike townspeople, His Majesty kept aside, didn't eat or drink, looked tired and simultaneously happy, which caused alarm in Lucas. Lucas cautiously, choosing words, tried to return his commander to life without war, remind about peace and quiet. However, these attempts came hard to him. Even through smile and awareness of Nightmare's completion, the Lord continued to grieve because of losses that occurred through his fault, and this shadow didn't allow him to celebrate. Here out of nowhere appeared the director of Empire Defense, holding a plate with vegetables. He believed that after mourning the fallen, it was time to celebrate victory and change mourning to noisy merriment. Having lost the remnants of fear, Idar began to forcefully feed Ash vegetables. Townspeople were indignant, raised a cry, and demanded that His Highness be served meat and strong spirits. A little later, Kirem arrived at the tables in a wheelchair. She was in strong alcoholic intoxication, grabbed the commander by the hands, and insistently asked for resignation. Soon, the girl's friends appeared and took her away from the celebration. Ash didn't know whether she would continue merrymaking or go to sleep, but was sure he wouldn't accept resignation. Having sat down at the festive table with Darkut, the Lord noticed with surprise that he was already quite drunk. Guessing who exactly got him drunk wasn't difficult for him. Nearby sat the soldier's combat friend in a skirt, one-eyed old woman Torona. She assured that Darkut was obliged to learn to drink and smoke, because he's a mercenary, not a child. His Highness, not wanting to listen to the drunken speeches of the corrupted old woman, led Darkhood away from the noisy company and tried to save him from further humiliation. Walking beside Ash, Darkhood confessed that alone he still remembered the dead friend's face and couldn't get rid of this image even after time. With slurred speech, the guy added that next to the commander, he forgot about his sorrows and fears. Not finishing the last thought, he finally fell asleep right on the go. Typical nerd knew perfectly well the reason for what was happening and understood that it was all about his skill. However, spreading this aloud and initiating surrounding people into the secret he had no right to do.